Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
Today we have Benedetta Cibrario, an Italian writer who has written many novels, and her first novel published by Feltrinelli, Rossovermiglio, had the Campiello Award in 2008, and it was translated and published in many foreign countries. And then she was in the final of the Premio Strega Award with her last book, the one before this new book, Il Rumore del Mondo. She just published for Mondadori a new novel titled Per ogni parola perduta, that is being published recently in Italy. So good morning. We will start by talking about you and this new book of yours. Can you tell me, how did you decide, or how did you understand that you wanted to be a writer? Is it something you always wanted to do? You decided later?
It is actually something I always wanted to do, but I was an eager reader. So I was thinking that trying to write was sometimes wasting my time instead of spending my time reading. But what I think it turns out when you are a writer, it is that somehow at a certain point you have to start. You cannot postpone it anymore. And this is exactly what happened to me.
And when did you start?
Actually, funnily enough, I start when I relocated to England. Because I write in Italian, I think that the idea was that somehow being a foreigner in England, Italian was really my mother tongue. So it was like almost, I wouldn't say longing, but going back home somehow. Because when you go back to your native language, somehow it's ultimately yours. Weirdly enough, has been a foreign country who had made me a writer.
This is the destiny of many writers, many famous writers, who have been living abroad or in other countries and writing in their own tongue. You know, I think in London, the first example, I think, is a writer called Canetti, who was writing in German and living almost his life in London. Or we have people like Beckett or Joyce, who lived abroad and all their lives and wrote in English. There is a difference. I mean, reading your novel, what I perceive as a feel is that each novel implies a lot of research, right? Because let's talk about this new novel, Parola Perduta. If I am not wrong, the book takes place in Oxford, in Chambéry, in Paris, and there is a central subject in this book, which is a balloon, you know? The world of balloons and all what this implies. So in order to describe Oxford, your characters, one of them is Russian, so you also had to know about Russia. Then there is Chambéry, which is not exactly the most popular and famous city in the world, so you describe it very well. Then you go into the world of balloons, and there is a bookshop of antique books, the bookseller. So in order to do that, you must have done a lot of research.
That's
because
the
it
fun.
doesn't seem autobiographical.
No,
right?
No. To me, that's the fun bit of all of it, because nobody can possibly be writing 8-9 hours a day. But what I really like is being sitting at the desk 8-9 hours a day. So usually I spend half of my day doing research, half of my day writing. I'm curious by nature, so that's the reason why I like to learn about things I don't really know. I didn't know anything about hot air balloon before starting writing these books, even less about Chambéry. I think it somehow fills the gap which I can feel there are in my plot during all this research, and also is a little bit of a, how would I say, something which protects me by the temptation of dripping autobiographical things into my writing.
How does it come that suddenly you are interested in balloons in the city of Chambéry? If I am not wrong, each one of your books, and we'll talk about later, has a different story, right? A different obsession, let's call it. Now, in this case, it's the balloon, the nest, and so on. So how did you decide that this could be a novel? How did it come into your mind?
This time I was really interested in two things. One was Xavier de Maistre, for the very simple reason that he never believed himself being a writer. He declared many times that he was a very unsuccessful guy. Indeed, he was not, probably. And that he was claiming that what is really important in life is to be a sort of a dilettante somehow. So that I found it fascinating and quite contemporary in a way. But I'm not a biographer, so I couldn't possibly write a biography of Xavier de Maistre, which spent a huge part of his life in Russia.
But he was from Chambéry.
He was from Chambéry. Actually, he walked from Turin. He was an army officer, which on 1799 walked from Turin to St. Petersburg. And also, when I find out that he was, I believe, the very first writer of the 18th century to have flown on a hot air balloon, I found this quite fascinating. Also, the balloons are, quite a metaphor. You can see things from another perspective, seeing everything from height. And also they imply to be very courageous, very curious. Again, curiosity is a main thing, is a real fil rouge in what I write. And so I decided to do some research about that. And I find out that this weird guy was also one of the very first ones to have flown in Chambéry in 1784. I thought, well, there's a story there. So let's...
And then you combine characters. How do you put together characters, story? How does it work?
I'm not one of the writers who draw a very specific program of what they're going to write. I really am very disorganized when I write. So I follow instinct or imagination. I don't really have a certain way of proceeding when I write. It is very tiring to write like this because most of the time you have to rewrite, to get rid of quite a big amount of pages you've been writing. You have to be very careful. But in the end, it's the only way I can do that.
I read some of your books, and for instance, Rossovermiglio or Lo Scurnuso, two of your other novels, are much shorter novels. This novel, Parola, perduta, and the one before, Il Rumore del Mondo, are much longer novels. Are they historical novels in a way? How do you put together fiction, fictional characters, and historical novel somehow? Is it what you want? Is it what you like to do? Because all of your novels anyway, at least the ones I read, are this one less, but they are talking about the past. Therefore, you must like history, you must like all these kind of things.
I do love history, but what I mainly like is memory, having memory of the past. And I do feel that every character of mine, but possibly every human being, is constantly facing what we call a sort of interaction with something, which is the world we are living in, which turns out to become history once the years will have passed. So we are dealing with history every second of our life. And I like to put my character in a sort of a tension between the everyday life and the big scheme, or what will become the big scheme of history. Also, this has caused somehow that my last novel was very, very long, because I wanted somehow to transmit to the reader that there are moments in history or in life where it looks like as time is slow in itself, So the pace which prepares the Risorgimento, which is the topic of the book Il Rumore del Mondo, is very, very slow. And so sometimes I try to transform this into actually the physical act of reading slowly and taking the reader slowly with me to see how these things develop in time. So I wouldn't say that I write longer books or shorter books. It's just when I feel it's what the subject really requires, whether it is short or...
In your books, some writers have one city or are obsessed by one city. Many writers. Joyce is obsessed by Dublin, Moravia is obsessed by Rome, Modiano is obsessed by Paris, and you are obsessed by more than a city. Your books, for instance, in Rossovermiglio, there are two landscapes. One is the city of Turin, the other one is the countryside in Tuscany, and there is a little bit of Florence. In this book, Lo Scurnuso, it's mainly Naples. So in this new book, Chambéry, as you said, it doesn't have to do with your life, it's an invention. It's something you... But the others are cities that somehow are linked to your biography, to your life, right?
Absolutely, yes. Actually, it is exactly me, because I was born in Florence. Part of my family lived in the countryside near Siena. My mother is from Naples. I grew up in Turin. And in my latest novel, in Per ogni parola, perduta, I've been living in Oxford, so we will quote Oxford. And even if I don't mention, there is a lot of Torino, which is really the town where I grew up and where I get to become who I am. Because Torino is a very literary town, I think.
But you describe places, for instance, Torino, but also Naples, and in great detail. So to do this, you said you spend 8 hours a day reading and writing, but did you go to Chambéry? How do you proceed in your topographic research? Or is it just memory or eventually invention?
No. What I do, it is invention at the beginning, entire invention. So it was for Chambéry, it was for Naples. But then I go to check. So I went to Chambéry 3 times, and that was difficult enough because it was during the pandemic, but I managed to go. I actually did exactly the same walk which one of my characters does in Naples, from the Centro Storico going up to Capodimonte. So I did exactly the same, and I went to Tuscany. So I would like to be extremely precise and check if my imagination got it right. But also what I did, for instance, in the Scurnuso, which is the small novel which is set, the first part of it is set in the 18th century, 18th, 19th century. I also went, in order to describe the places, to provide descriptions, to look at a lot of paintings and views of Naples from every single angle, because it was like getting help from another artist, from an artist's point of view, and seeing a lot of views of the town gave me the idea of what the perception of the light, of the colors, of the distance were, so that I could refer to that while I was writing. And I did the same more or less with all the books. With Il Rumore del Mondo, which is the one set in the Risorgimento, I went to see hundreds of museums wherever I could, in Rome, here at the Vittorio and Albert, to see how they were dressed. Even if there are no descriptions of dresses and shoes or whatever, but as a writer, I need to know even the color of the underwear of my characters.
In a sense, you're not in the Chambéry, not in the last one, which seems to be a little different from the other ones. But talk a lot about one of the minorities, which is the aristocracy, right? You seem to know a lot about the aristocratic world in Europe, in Italy, in Turin, Naples, and with all the nuances and differences that there may be between one place and the other, right? And you describe the lives, the palazzos, the servants, the way they live, the way they eat. In the first book, there is a lot of shishi and champagne and the way of life of that world. Why did you decide to describe that particular world?
Because I think that it was somehow out of fashion, because it was a sort of a dusty world, which now has no interest whatsoever, and with a lot of responsibilities. During the Second World War and before the Second World War, the Italian aristocracy had huge responsibility. because they simply didn't care about what was happening. They didn't care about Mussolini. The only real problem was really, is this guy looks quite vulgar, which is actually one of the things I've been told, that it was when Mussolini went to Turin in 1923 to visit the Fiat, and it was on and so they put flags all around town, and then he was photographed, and it was a huge photograph of Mussolini for La Stampa, and I found the comment on the La Stampa article saying that, I don't remember now the name of the family, but someone would say, you see, the guy is wearing like a grey coat in the morning. How vulgar is that? And so I think I cannot believe that everything was only under the sort of aesthetic point of view. And even though, if we remember that in 1946, it was the very first time that women voted in Italy.
Yeah, this is very well described in your book, Rossovermiglio.
And they didn't know what they were doing. So immense responsibility of the Italian aristocracy. Let's not forget that I went to the Quirinale because I was invited by one of the presidents of the Republic, and with a group of writers. And I managed to see the setting of the table of the visit of Himmler and Hitler in Rome. And we saw the table with all the names of the aristocracy. Neither Himmler nor Hitler, they didn't.
So in a way, you are criticizing.
Oh, yes.
Very much.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Right.
Yes.
And you criticize the irresponsibility of this minority.
Yes, I do. Huge responsibility.
Right. Even in your book, Lo Scurnuso, sorry if I have difficulty of pronouncing. In this case, you create a Duke. There is a Duke in the book who instead is kind of very protecting the fact that there are some Jewish people in his family, and therefore wants to send them to America, right, to protect them from what's happening, right? So not all of your characters are terrible.
No, not. Yes, of course there are. I mean, there are incredible exceptions, In Rome, in Palazzo Doria, we all knew that there was like a hidden apartment where the former Prince Doria Pamphili was helping people. And so they were in Chambéry, which I just find out doing the research. So we cannot say that we're also people helping. But when something terrible happens to a country, there is also a widespread responsibility.
Yeah, but you also describe the fact that when women have to vote, and there is the moment of voting for monarchy or republic, this is, I think, in Rossovermiglio, most people thought that anyway monarchy would win, right?
Yes.
Which was highly improbable considering what they did.
Yes.
So you always have one character, I mean, not always, I don't know, who's saving, in this case, the woman of Rossovermiglio, the protagonist, the Duke in this other book. But I wanted to ask you another question. It's very difficult to define a novel or a novelist, but I think that there is an obsession in your books, which is, in the case of your last book, is the balloon. In the case of Lo Scurnuso is an object, right? Yes. I won't tell the story, but it is a bit the story not only of the persons who did the object and the person who owned the object, but it's also the story of the object in itself that is going through centuries from one place to the other, one family to... So the object follows what happens in the world, right? Because they sell the palazzo and therefore there's a fire, and then the object is saved. So how do you pick up your objects? I mean, and how does it work? Because I want to help you with my question. There are writers. One is Umberto Eco, the Foucault Pendulum, one of his novels. The other one is Bruce Chatwin's book, Oots. Oots is an obsession for a collector of porcelain in Prague. So the novel and the obsession and the collection and the porcelain, in your case, this Scurnuso, is very central in the novel.
Yes.
So do you start by the object?
Yeah, I start with the obsession. I like obsessive characters. And I found that obsession is very interesting to describe and to try to understand. Obsession for objects is something I do share with most of my characters. And it's interesting because obsession for objects is usually unrelated to fashion, unrelated to sometimes even to the value of the object itself. And any sort of obsessive characters under this point of view is very interesting for me to understand because, as you know, being a writer yourself, what is interesting really is that when we write, we start to understand our characters. We have to understand them. And this is what happens while we're writing. We do understand them.
But why this Scurnuso, for instance, is so much wanted? Or what is it? It's a very difficult name to pronounce.
Yes,
it is an object. It was created in Capodimonte, no?
Yes.
But what it is?
It is actually a terracotta. It's a tiny little terracotta statue. This relates to the glorious moment of the Nativity, which was very fashionable in the reign of Naples, starting from the mid-18th century. And it was not really related to religion. I mean, not so much. It was not such as a proof of whatever, being religious or spirituality or whatever. It was much more the collection of the objects. So the very, very great artists were doing these objects. We have Vaccaro, which is the sculpture of the magnificent Cappella San Severo in Naples, and many other important. Because they were doing not only the big statues, which adored most of the palazzo and churches in Naples, but also this tiny figure, which were highly collectibles and very expensive.
It's a bit like a Japanese.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, exactly like a Japanese. And actually, this was so fashionable that even the king, Charles III of Bourbon, and all the court, they start preparing this nativity, and every single artist drawing objects for the nativity were artists usually doing other things. For instance, the sword maker would have done tiny, tiny little swords, and so the Capodimonte factory would have done tiny, tiny little porcelain things to put on the tables, and so on. I've seen most of these. I mean, there is one nativity like this in New York, which can be seen in the Metropolitan. In Naples, of course, there are many in the museums. And what has always fascinated me is all these sculptures, the very beautiful one, are by anonymous artists. And the anonymity of the artist, which I think is very moving, you know, when you concentrate on doing something with all your soul and body, and then it is anonymous. Nobody will ever know that you did it. I think this is a very moving thing. So that's why I decided to write this.
So there are these odd, let's say, objects who are the main character, the main reason of the book, right?
Yes.
But then you talk also, you said about criticize in your books the aristocracy for their behavior vis-a-vis the politics and what's going on in the world. But you also describe all your people are divorced, or they have bad marriages, or they have love habits. You know, they all are very misguided, these characters, in a way, right? So you like that? I mean, even in this last book, for each world lost, per ogni parola, perduta, if there's not a difficult relationship with the husband of the principal character, then the other one, the librarian, the person who had the bookstore, had a terrible relationship with her mother, and the mother has left the father, and in Rossovermiglio there is a wife who's completely, against this terrible husband that the parents have decided that she should marry, and then she goes away, and then she lives with a lover in a world where this is completely odd. So what is that humanity? You know, why they are so misguided? You like it? Is your experience? Is it autobiographical?
Well, it is autobiographical in the sense that I do
misbehave.
No. But I do see what happens around me. I mean, there is some toxicity. Can we say toxicity? It's poisonous sometimes. The family relation. I mean, family is obviously incredibly important, but it is also like a well of poisonous relationship among people. It's always difficult to be within a family or to be in a marriage. It's difficult to be daughter, son of, difficult to be mother, father of. So,
Yeah,
so
but
why
in
not
your
discuss
books,
this?
nobody makes real efforts, right?
No.
There's lots of secrets and lies.
Yes, yes. But
Because
secrets.
you think that this is the nature, the human nature, I mean, all this?
I think that having secrets in life is something which is easier in most cases. You know, it's so much more difficult to have the courage to say loudly your truth, the truth. Much easier to have many little drawers around you where you put your tiny little secrets and to avoid confrontations.
And all these people, not only they ruin their own lives or they misbehave, but they ruin their own fortune, right? Because
Yes,
they're
well,
never successful, these people. Right? They're not, they lose everything or they have terrible things happening.
yes, but this is what interesting. What happens when you start losing all your money or when you lose all the prestige of your family, when a huge series of misunderstanding put you in the situation of losing your friends, your lovers, your wife, your husband. But then in the end, there's always at least one character wise enough to try to
repair the damage.
the damage.
Not in the case of Scurnuso, but usually you have strong women with a lot of character. This is you.
Well, yes, me, my sisters, my mother, my grandmother, being an Italian family. I don't know whether Italian applies or whether Italian is important detail about that. But we come from a long line of very strong women in our family. So, yes, my women are usually strong characters.
With a sense of independence and they are revolte, they are against.
Yes.
In both senses.
Yes, yes.
I mean, the mother in Rossovermiglio, she wants to keep dignity, as if the world hasn't changed.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Actually, that sort of sentence, which we have in Rossovermiglio, was something that my great-grandmother used to say, which was her leitmotif all her life, which in Italian sounds ordino, comando e voglio. So I order, I command, and I want. So, we grew up with this.
So these poor men around these terrible women, how do they survive? Badly, I guess.
With lovers, I think. With lovers, probably, going out of the family most of the time, ignoring this sort of...
But in this society, all is more or less accepted, right?
It was, yes.
So, if we have to decide what kind of writer you are, what kind of obsessions you have, because these books can be totally out of the world or completely contemporary, but they have a lot of ingredients. Right? We tried in this interview to find out several of your ingredients. But at the end of the day, what kind of writer you are? Do you still have the urge of writing? Are you waiting for a new obsession to come, or you already have one? How does it work?
No,
who are you as a writer?
As a writer, I think that I have a sort of an urge to write. So even now, the book has just been published and I'm really looking forward to start writing again. What sort of writer am I?
So writing, as you say, then we go, it's a métier, and to write.
Yes.
Once you write the first book, then you cannot stop.
Yes.
With another book, another book, another book.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because you don't know how to live without it.
Yes. Yes, I cannot how to live without it. And the metaphor may not really be understood by someone who is not a smoker, but I've been a smoker for many years.
And there is an obsession of smoking in Per ogni parola, perduta.
Yes, there is an obsession.
Yes. Keeper, she smokes a cigarette after the other, right?
Yes, but when I don't write, it is exactly the same feeling which I had when I was still smoking, when the on a Sunday tobacco is closed, and you freak out because you can't have those. For me, it's exactly the same when I don't write. I have to write. I don't know what this means. I think that for me, writing has something to do with tidying up what is around me. When I write, I think that the written world is a way to organize the world which I see around me, for me.
You don't talk much about the world around you.
Well, I do, but I conceal that. There's a sort of a camouflage. Most of the time, when I write about other centuries, other eras, I do camouflage what I live and what I experience now. I do this a lot.
So they are autobiographical camouflage.
Of course, there is, yes.
But this is in the feelings more than in the story itself.
It's in the feeling.
No?
It's in the feeling. It's in the feeling.
The family things.
It is in the feeling. It's in things that I've seen, that I've experienced, and even sometimes things that I thought or I felt. But I usually put a little bit of all this in every single character. There is never one character which is me. There are parts of me in every character.
And is it on purpose that sometimes you lose yourself in details?
Yes.
As you said at the beginning, I want to know the dress, exactly how it was.
Yes.
And there's a lot of description of streets, of places, of houses, details, the way they dress, the way they are, the interior of the place where they are.
I think this is mainly to do with the fact that I graduated in history of cinema. I have been a compulsive and obsessive film moviegoer for years, and that I am visual. I'm very visual. So by the obsession of details, I somehow want to recreate for myself and for the reader a sort of a cinematic sort of experience. I would like them to see, not only to read, but to see what I'm describing.
You said this is a paradox, in the sense that you think of cinema, but makes me think of, for instance, there is a Balzac novel titled, I think, the Père Goriot, where there are pages and pages of the description of a pension or a pension, which in the cinema will be one image, right?
Yes.
But at that time, there was no cinema. Instead, now there is cinema.
I know, and sometimes I lose myself into describing too many details. But in the end, is also...
No, it can be very interesting. It's up to you. What I believe each writer has his own characteristic, his own style, his own... your language, for instance, is very in Italian. I don't know how much you work on the language, but it's very fluent and very easy. No, it's rich and fluent. Do you pay a lot of attention to the language? Do you write and rewrite, or it comes out like this?
No, a lot. I write and rewrite every day when I start writing. Before starting the new day, I go backwards and read the previous pages, and I correct for at least the first couple of hours, and then I start a new page. So I pay a lot of attention to the words.
So what kind of writer you are? You write a first draft, the whole novel, or you are writing page after page? Because these are two different ways of writing. Some writers write the whole book, and then they change it and write it again. They cut or they add. Others, they want the page to be almost perfect, and then they go to the next page.
I am this kind of writer.
You are this kind of writer.
Yes, totally.
And how is it at the end of the day to live in the English world and to write in Italian? It's like a secret?
It suits me very well because I can write when I feel a bit of uneasiness. I don't belong here. My English is not good enough. My relations are not... I have very few English friends. And I live...
But you have spent a lot of time in England.
Yes, I do. Yes, a lot of time in England. A lot of time in England, but never really having roots here. My roots are definitely in Italy. And this is very interesting because I feel clumsy in a way where I live, and being clumsy when I do things or I see people makes me long to go at my desk and be there. I like to be living like that, a foreigner in a foreign country.
And you will be living like this forever in a way, or you think you may go back to live in Italy one day?
Well, funnily enough, most of my novels have been written when I was abroad. When I'm in Italy, I find it more difficult to write, even less interesting somehow, because I think that I need the distance. I need to be far away in order to have perspective.
And when you talk about characters who live, for instance, you were mentioning the behavior of aristocratic world vis-à-vis the fascist regime, which has lasted 20 more years in Italy. The fascist regime, for instance, changed very much the Italian language, and therefore there was a particular way of speaking, and some of that probably remained in today's Italian. What kind of language you use? Your characters are in the past. You try to rebuild the language of the time, or you give them the language of today?
No, I do a mixture, because I try to give what would have been the feeling of a language, which is what I did in Rossovermiglio, and the same in the novel set in Naples, in the Scurnuso. So the language is, which is divided in three parts. So the first two parts are set in ancient times, so the language there is slightly different. And of course, then there is the Neapolitan dialect. So I try just to do the construction of the sentence, let's say, but I didn't do Camilleri. I didn't create a dialect or a language. No, not at all. But the sort of words, the sound of them, it's very much what...
But it's very difficult. Reading your books, in the middle of the reading of your books, I read a book by Giorgio Bassani, titled L'Airone, where he not only he tries to rebuild the language that they speak in that part, in the countryside or little villages around the city of Ferrara in Italy, but he also uses dialects, and because until not very long time ago, in the different parts of Italy, people were speaking in a dialect. Plus, you very often talk about the upper class world, the aristocratic world, and the people who work for them, right? And there was in Italian the same difference of language that there is, for instance, in England between the different classes of people.
Yes. In Italy, the aristocracy or the posh people in Italy used to speak only French or dialects, or dialects. For instance, in Turin, which I didn't know, the dialect of Turin, there are many different dialects. I found that when I was writing the book. And an historian told me that the aristocracy, for instance, in the 19th century, during the Cavour time, or Garibaldi time, they were talking either French in the parties or Torinese, dialect of Torinese. But also that Torinese, the dialect of Cavour, let's say, the Torinese of Cavour, would have never been the same kind of Torinese of the people, the worker of the house or whatever. So this thing of identifying the provenance of people by the way they speak, I think is common to, at least to the language which I know more, which are English and Italian, but it probably has been like this since ever. I mean, if you think in Latin Rome, the aristocracy or whatever, the senators were speaking in a sort of language which was not the language of the crowd.
So it is difficult for you because you go back in different centuries, so your rebuilding of the Italian language is quite difficult. Or you find your own language.
Well, yes, we do.
You think of the readers when you write?
Yes, I do, but all the time, of course. But more in terms of the fact that I don't write for myself. I know I write for someone else.
What is the Scurnuso?
It comes from the dialect Neapolitan saying lo scorno.
De Val, he talks about this Japanese.
You're talking about the netsuke of the
Yeah,
dog.
the netsuke. So the netsuke are this, right? And the grandfather, whatever, uncle, is a collector. What is the Scurnuso? Is it the name of one of the many objects, or is it a specific object that people in Naples like to have at home?
It
You
is.
title your book Lo Scurnuso. What is Lo Scurnuso?
Lo Scurnuso is a small terracotta statue. Usually these are called academia, which means that is just entirely made of terracotta. And in this case, it's a terracotta which is done by an orphan, an artist, and he is representing his adoptive father, and he's seeing him as this crippled man. And the reason why it's named the Scurnuso is that the Scurnuso relates to someone who is ashamed of something. And this man is ashamed of not being rich or famous anymore. So I gave the name of the sculpture, the terracotta sculpture, and I named him after this guy, which is named by the other characters in the novel, Lo Scurnuso, so the one who's ashamed of.
So these objects don't have this very name.
No, it's like a nickname. It's like a nickname of someone.
For instance, in your book, Lo Scurnuso, you talk about a specific world of artists, of artisans and who create this very, in Naples, there is this ambition, this specialty to create this, in Italian it's presepe, and I don't know how is it called in English.
I think nativity or creche.
And there is a kind of, pride to have the best one possible, right? And some now, even today, in the Certosa di San Martino, there are lots of them that you can see, right? Still see. So who is this Scurnuso? Is a specific character inside this presepe?
The Scurnuso, it is actually what is also called in Italian lo storpio, the cripple. The cripple is a typical figure in the nativity, in the presepe. So the Scurnuso is the cripple, but the Scurnuso in itself is the nickname of the crippled man in the novel.
That the artist has taken as a model to create this little character that is due to be inside the presepe, right?
Yes, correct.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for this interview.
Alain Elkann interviews.